I've been turning something over in my mind for weeks now, maybe longer. It's not a question exactly, more like a feeling that won't settle. You know how sometimes you read something and it doesn't hit you right away, but then days later, in the middle of doing something completely unrelated, it surfaces and you realize you've been carrying it with you the whole time. That's what happened with the Anunnaki texts. Not the modern stuff, not the theories or the documentaries or the confident blog posts. The actual clay tablets, the ones pressed by Sumerian hands somewhere around 4,000 years ago, maybe more. I keep coming back to them because I think they're trying to tell us something that got lost somewhere between then and now, something about limits and what happens when we forget them. I should say this up front because it matters. I'm not here to tell you what's true or what you should believe. I don't know what's true. I don't think anyone does, not really, not about things this old and this strange. What I want to do tonight is sit with what the texts actually say, slowly, without rushing toward conclusions or certainty. If you're here for answers, for proof, for some kind of revelation, you're probably in the wrong place. But if you're here because you're curious about what ancient people thought was important enough to preserve, about what they were warning each other about in their own way, then maybe we're in the right place together. And listen, if this approach feels right to you, if you want more of this kind of thing, there's a subscribe button around here somewhere. No pressure. I make these for the people who want to slow down and actually think, who don't mind uncertainty, who value the questions as much as any answer we might find. That's all I'll say about that. Actually, before we go any further, I'm curious about something. Where are you right now? What time is it where you're listening to this? I like knowing that these words are reaching people in different time zones, different rhythms of the day or night. There's something grounding about it, something that connects us across all this distance. Drop it in the comments if you want. I read them, I promise. So, the Anunnaki. Even saying the name feels heavy somehow, weighted with all the baggage it's accumulated over the years. But I want to try to strip that away, try to hear it fresh, the way someone in ancient Sumer might have heard it, when it was just part of the world they inherited, part of the tradition they were responsible for passing on. The word itself, Anunnaki in Sumerian, is debated. Some scholars translate it as those of princely seed, others as those who from heaven to earth came. The key definitely means earth, and An is sky or heaven, but the middle part, the Nunna, that's where opinions split. I'm not a linguist. I can't settle that debate. What I can do is look at how they appear in the texts, what role they play, what the stories seem to be preserving about them. The earliest references are frustratingly sparse. We get lists, names in temple records, mentions in prayers and oath formulas. The Anunnaki are there, they're important. They witness things, they enforce things, but we don't get much personality or story. It's only as Sumerian literature develops, as we get into the myths and epics, that a clearer picture starts to emerge. And what emerges isn't what I expected the first time I really paid attention. It's not gods behaving like capricious children, though that's how we often characterize ancient mythology. It's more structured than that, more deliberate. The Anunnaki appear as a council, an assembly. They gather, they deliberate, they make decisions collectively. There are hierarchies among them, sure, but there's also process, procedure, something that almost looks like law. In the myths that survive, the Anunnaki are deeply involved in creation, in organizing the world, in establishing civilization. They set up the first cities, they assign kingship, they teach crafts and agriculture. They're active, present, shaping things. But what stays with me, what I keep circling back to, is that this involvement doesn't last. There's a pattern in these texts of engagement followed by withdrawal, of creation followed by something that looks like regret, or at least recalibration. Let me try to walk through this carefully because the details matter and they usually get flattened out. The Eridu Genesis is one of our oldest flood narratives, older than the biblical flood, older than most of the versions people are familiar with. It's fragmentary. Time and moisture, and the simple fact of being clay has destroyed parts of it. But what remains is striking. The text describes the Anunnaki as involved in the early stages of humanity, in the founding of cities, in the establishment of order. But then humanity multiplies. We spread. And the text uses this specific word that's usually translated as noise or clamour. It's not just that there were a lot of us. It's that we were loud, disruptive to something, to some kind of order or peace that had existed before. The response from the divine realm is to reduce humanity. Plague first, then drought, then ultimately the decision for a great flood. Now, you could read this as angry gods punishing noisy humans, and that's how it's often taught. But I don't think that's quite right, or at least not completely. If you sit with the text, if you don't rush it, what comes through isn't really anger in the way we understand it. It's more like cosmic imbalance, like something exceeded its intended scope, like a creation that threatened to undermine the stability it was supposed to support. The Atrahasis epic gives us more detail, more context. This is a Babylonian text later than the Sumerian sources, but clearly drawing on older traditions, older memory. In Atrahasis, the creation of humans is explicit in its purpose. The Anunnaki create us to do work, not because they love us, not out of abundance or generosity, but because the lesser gods, called the Igigi, were exhausted from maintaining the earth, digging canals, doing the labour required to keep the world functioning. The Igigi rebelled, they threw down their tools, they marched on the chief god's residence and demanded change. So the Anunnaki, led by Enki, the god of wisdom and water, and the birth goddess Nintu, they decide to create a substitute labour force. Us, humanity. We're made from clay and the blood of Wee-Ila, one of the Igigi rebels who gets slaughtered for the purpose. And that detail haunts me. There's violence in our origin according to this text. There's the blood of a rebel god mixed into our very substance. What does that mean? I don't know, but it feels important, like it's pointing to something about our nature, our tendency toward the very rebellion that required our creation in the first place. At first, the arrangement works. Humans labour, we build, we maintain the irrigation systems that make civilization possible in that harsh environment between the rivers. We serve the gods through sacrifice and temple maintenance, but then again, we multiply. The text is specific. Our noise disturbs Enlil's sleep. Enlil is the chief executive god in this pantheon, the enforcer of divine order, and he can't rest because of human clamour. The response is systematic. First plague. It doesn't work. We survive. We adapt. Then drought. Then famine. Still we persist. Finally, the decision is made for total flood, for complete reset. But here's where it gets complicated, where the simple narrative of angry gods breaks down. The Anunnaki are not united in this decision. Enki opposes it. He warns Atrahasis, the Sumerian flood hero. He teaches him to build a boat, to save himself and his family and seed stock and craftsmen, to preserve the possibility of continuation. And when Enlil discovers after the flood that humans survived, that Enki subverted the decree, there's a confrontation. But it doesn't end in punishment. It ends in negotiation, in a new arrangement. This is crucial, I think. The new arrangement isn't just try again and hope it works out better this time. The new arrangement builds limits directly into human biology. Death becomes universal. Before this, according to the text, some humans apparently lived indefinitely. Now everyone dies. Infant mortality is introduced. Some women are made infertile. Certain priestess classes are forbidden from having children. Population control is built into the system itself, into our bodies, so that periodic catastrophic reduction won't be necessary. We're allowed to continue, but with built-in constraints. What are we supposed to do with that? How are we meant to read it? As mythology in the dismissive sense, just made up stories to explain why people die and why some women can't have children. As theology, revealing something true about the relationship between divine and human. Realms, as garbled history, preserving memory of real catastrophic floods and real social reorganizations, or as something else entirely, something we don't quite have language for. My honest answer, the one I keep coming back to no matter how much I read or think about this, is that I don't know, and I suspect the Sumerians didn't fully know either. But what I am increasingly convinced of is that these texts function as preserved caution. Not prophecy about our specific future, but warning about patterns, about what happens when creation exceeds sustainable parameters, when noise overwhelms order, when the created exhaust or turn against their function. There's something in these texts about limits, about the necessity of boundaries, about what happens when those boundaries are ignored or transgressed. And that feels relevant to me in ways I'm still working out. Let me slow down here and get more specific about the Anunnaki themselves, about how they're actually described when we have descriptions rather than just names in lists. In several texts, particularly the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and in various Sumerian hymns, the Anunnaki are shown gathering in assembly to make major decisions. This assembly has a name, the Ubshukina. It's a sacred hall, a place of deliberation. And what strikes me about these assembly scenes is how procedural they are, how structured. This isn't whimsical divine action. Decisions are debated. There are votes, essentially. There are oaths and witnesses and consequences for breaking protocol. In the Enuma Elish, when Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, is elevated to supreme authority over the pantheon, it happens through the assembly. The Anunnaki test his power. They make him demonstrate his ability to create and destroy with his word alone. He speaks a constellation into existence, then speaks it out of existence. Only after this demonstration do they grant him authority, and even then it's formalized, sworn, witnessed. It reads more like the establishment of a government than like mythology in the way we usually use that word. And throughout these assembly scenes, there's this consistent theme of establishing and enforcing limits. Not just human limits, but cosmic limits, divine limits. When the world is organized in these creation accounts, it's not a process of making something wild and chaotic. It's imposing structure on chaos, drawing clear boundaries between separate domains. Heaven and earth are divided. The fresh water under the earth, the Abzu, is separated from the salt water of the ocean. Day and night are established as distinct. The seasons are fixed in their cycles. And these aren't just physical arrangements. They're legal boundaries, sacred divisions that aren't supposed to be crossed. There are gods assigned to maintain each domain, responsibilities given and accepted. When these boundaries are violated, there are consequences. The texts are clear about that. Tiamat, the primordial saltwater ocean goddess, is killed, and her body used to form the cosmos because she represents chaos that won't submit to order, that actively fights against boundaries and structure. Her destruction is violent, necessary according to the logic of the text, and final. From her corpse, Marduk creates the world as we know it. Her eyes become the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates. Her tail becomes the Milky Way. Chaos is not eliminated, but contained, repurposed, made to serve structure. And I find myself wondering if this isn't just cosmology, if there's also political philosophy here, social commentary, warning about what happens when order breaks down or when chaos refuses to be contained. The Sumerians lived in a precarious environment. The floods between the Tigris and Euphrates were real, unpredictable, devastating. Civilization there required constant maintenance, constant labour, constant vigilance. The canals had to be dug and cleaned. The levees had to be maintained. One season of neglect could mean starvation. One unexpected flood could erase everything. Is it any wonder their myths are obsessed with order and chaos, with the necessity of boundaries, with the labour required to maintain structure against the constant pressure of dissolution? Part 1. I want to dig into something that usually gets skipped over. Something about the way the Anunnaki are described in their relationship to humanity after that initial creation period. Because it's not just that they made us and then occasionally intervened when we got too loud or too numerous. There's a gradual withdrawal happening in these texts, a stepping back that feels deliberate, almost like a decision to let us figure things out on our own within certain constraints. The earliest Sumerian king lists, these fascinating documents that blend mythology and what might be history. They describe kingship as something that descended from heaven. The Anunnaki, or the gods more broadly, they directly ruled in the beginning according to these lists. The reigns are impossibly long, 28,000 years for one king, 43,000 for another. Obviously not literal, but pointing to something, maybe to a time when divine presence was more direct, more constant, more involved in daily governance. Then something shifts. The lengths of reigns start to decrease. The kings become more human in scale, more historical in feel. There's a flood mentioned, always a flood, and after it the kingship descends again but differently. The kings are human now, or mostly human. They still claim divine sanction, divine ancestry sometimes, but they're not gods themselves. They're intermediaries, representatives. And the Anunnaki, they're still there in the background, still watching, still enforcing certain cosmic laws, but they're not ruling directly anymore. They've withdrawn to some degree. Why? The texts don't spell it out. We're left to interpret, to guess, to wonder. One reading, the one that keeps pulling at me, is that this represents a transition from direct management to something more like stewardship under supervision. Humanity is given responsibility, real authority within limits, but also accountability. We're allowed to organize ourselves, to make decisions, to build and create and govern. but there are boundaries we're not supposed to cross, principles we're expected to uphold, and when we violate those, there are consequences, though even the consequences seem to become less direct over time. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, probably the most famous Sumerian text we have, the Anunnaki appear at crucial moments, but they're not the main actors. Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, 2/3 god and 1/3 human according to the text, which is a strange fraction that bothers me every time I read it, but let's set that aside. He's powerful, arrogant, oppressive to his people. The people cry out to the gods. The gods respond not by directly intervening against Gilgamesh, but by creating Enkidu, a wild man, to balance him, to challenge him, to eventually befriend him and humanize him. It's indirect, it's subtle compared to just striking Gilgamesh down or removing his kingship. Later in the epic, when Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull of heaven and Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, the gods convene and decide someone must die for this transgression. They choose Enkidu, and Enkidu's death, his slow decline from divine curse, it destroys Gilgamesh emotionally. It sends him on his quest for immortality, which he ultimately fails to achieve. The lesson, if there is one, seems to be about accepting human limits, about mortality, about the boundaries between divine and human realms that can't be crossed no matter how powerful you are. But here's what interests me about the Anunnaki and Gilgamesh. They're present in the assembly that makes these decisions, but we don't get individual personalities for most of them. They're a collective, a council, almost bureaucratic in function. Only a few gods get speaking roles, get individual characterization. The rest, the Anunnaki as a group, they witness, they vote, they enforce. It's like they're the structure itself, the cosmic order personified, rather than individual actors with their own agendas. And maybe that's the point. Maybe in Sumerian thought, the Anunnaki represent something more abstract than we usually imagine when we think of gods. Not personalities to please or appease, but principles to understand and respect. Limits that exist whether we acknowledge them or not. Consequences that follow transgression regardless of intent. There's a text called the Sumerian flood story, different from Eridu Genesis, though covering similar ground, where the protagonist is Ziusudra, another flood hero, another Noah figure. In this version, Ziusudra is described as pious, attentive, constantly listening. The text says he stood by a wall and heard a god, probably Enki, though the tablet is damaged, warning him about the coming flood. He listened through a wall. He overheard what wasn't quite meant for him. And because he was paying attention, because he heard the warning and acted on it, he survived. After the flood, the text says the Anunnaki granted him eternal life and placed him in Dilmun, a kind of paradise. But notice he's removed from the human world. He survives, he's rewarded, but he's no longer part of the human story. He doesn't get to stay and rebuild and teach. He's taken elsewhere. Is that reward or is it exile? I honestly can't decide. Maybe it's both. What haunts me about these flood narratives, and there are several from Mesopotamia with variations in detail but consistency in theme, is the question of why preserve them. Why tell and retell the story of humanity almost being wiped out? If it's just mythology, why this mythology? Why not something more comforting, more affirming? Why preserve the memory, real or constructed, of near extinction? One answer is that it's historical, that these floods happened, that the memory is real even if the details are mythologized. The region did flood catastrophically. We have geological evidence of major floods in Mesopotamia. It's possible some of these events were so traumatic, so civilization ending for the people who experienced them, that the memory got preserved and mythologized and passed down. But I think there's more to it than that. I think these stories function as warning, as cautionary preservation. They say to each new generation, this happened, or could happen, or almost happened. We came close to ending. We survived by listening, by building, by respecting limits we were warned about. Don't forget this. Don't get so confident, so numerous, so loud that you trigger the response again. The Akkadian version of the flood story, in the Epic of Atrahasis that I mentioned earlier, it includes this detail after the flood that I can't stop thinking about. After Atrahasis survives, after Enlil discovers humans persist, there's this moment where Enki defends his actions. He says, more or less, I didn't reveal the divine secret directly, I sent a dream. I spoke through a reed wall. The man was clever enough to understand it's a technicality, a loophole. Enki didn't break the decree, he just bent it, worked around it. And Enlil, instead of punishing Enki, instead of trying again to eliminate humanity, he accepts a compromise. The new arrangement I mentioned before, the built-in biological limits, that's the compromise. And there's something in this moment that feels important about how gods, or cosmic forces, or however we want to understand these entities, how they operate according to rules too. They're not arbitrary. They're bound by something, by oaths or cosmic law, or their own nature. Enki can't just save humans by fiat. He has to work within the system, find a loophole, then negotiate a new arrangement. Even the gods have constraints. I keep using the word gods, but I'm not sure it's the right word, at least not in the way we usually mean it. The Sumerian concept seems more complex, more layered. There are the great gods, the cosmic forces, An, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Ninhursag. Then there are the Anunnaki, this council or collective. Then there are the Igigi, the lesser gods who do labour. Then there are city gods, personal gods, protective spirits, demons, all sorts of entities operating at different scales and with different functions. It's not a simple hierarchy, it's more like an ecosystem, a cosmic ecology, where everything has a place and a role and consequences for stepping out of that role. And humans, we're part of that ecology. We're not outside it, not separate, not exempt. We have a function, a place, boundaries appropriate to our nature. When we honour those, things work. When we transgress them, there are consequences, sometimes catastrophic ones. There's a tablet, a wisdom text really, called the Instructions of Shuruppak. Shuruppak was supposedly the last king before the flood, and this text presents his advice to his son Ziusudra. Yes, the same Ziusudra from the flood story. It's practical advice mostly. Don't buy a donkey that brays too much. Don't speak improperly to your mother. Don't break into a house. But woven through the practical advice are these warnings about respecting the gods, about knowing your place, about the dangers of arrogance and excess. It feels less like religious instruction and more like survival wisdom. Things learnt the hard way, things worth preserving. And I wonder if that's what a lot of these texts are. Not theology in the sense of explaining the nature of the divine, but preserved caution in the sense of, here's what we learned, here's what happened when we forgot, here's what to remember. The thing is, we can't know how the Sumerians themselves understood these texts. We're separated by 4,000 years, by dead languages, by completely different worldviews and categories of thought. We read them through our assumptions about mythology, religion, history, literature, science. We try to fit them into our boxes. But maybe they didn't fit into boxes like that. Maybe the Sumerian who pressed these stories into clay, who carefully preserved them, who taught them to students in the scribal schools, maybe they understood them as something that was simultaneously true history and true myth, and true warning and true poetry, without needing to separate those categories. Maybe the question, did this really happen, would have seemed strange to them, too simple, missing the point. The point being not whether Atrahasis literally built an ark, but whether we remember that our existence is precarious, that we've come close to ending, that there are limits we ignore at our peril. Part 2, I want to shift slightly here to something that bothers me about most modern treatments of the Anunnaki, about how these ancient traditions get used and misused now. Because somewhere between the clay tablets and today, something got twisted, simplified, sensationalized. The Anunnaki became aliens, genetic engineers, ancient astronauts, puppet masters controlling human history. They became proof of conspiracy, evidence of hidden truth, symbols of esoteric knowledge kept from the masses. And look, I get the appeal. I understand why people reach for those interpretations. The modern world feels controlled, manipulated, like we're not being told the truth about important things. So finding ancient texts that seem to describe powerful beings from the sky who created and controlled humanity, that resonates with those feelings. It provides a framework, a narrative, villains and victims and hidden knowledge. But here's my problem with it, my real issue. Those modern interpretations usually ignore what the texts actually say, in favour of what people want them to say. They cherry-pick lines, strip context, add assumptions from other sources, and end up with something that sounds ancient and profound but has almost nothing to do with Sumerian thought. The actual Sumerian texts, when you sit with them, when you read them in translation with scholarly footnotes, explaining the damaged parts and the ambiguous words and the cultural context we're guessing at, they're stranger and more subtle than the modern versions. They don't read like accounts of alien genetic experiments. They read like attempts to understand power, hierarchy, responsibility, consequence. They read like preserved memory of social organization, of the move from small communities to complex urban states, of the trauma that must have accompanied that transformation, because becoming civilized, building cities, accepting kings and priests and laws and taxes, that's not a neutral process. It requires giving up autonomy, accepting hierarchy, submitting to structures that might not serve your immediate interest. The Sumerians were among the first to do this at scale, or at least among the first we have records of, and their myths, their traditions about the Anunnaki, maybe those are processing that transformation, explaining it, justifying it, warning about it. When the texts say the Anunnaki established kingship, gave it to humans as a gift or a burden, I don't think we need to imagine literal beings descending from spaceships. I think we can read it as mythologized memory of social change, of the emergence of centralized authority, attributed to divine sanction because that's how authority legitimized itself in that world. When the texts say the Anunnaki created humans to do labor, to maintain the earth, we don't need genetic engineering. We can read it as the perspective of the laboring class, the farmers and canal diggers, whose work sustained the cities and temples, understanding themselves as created for that function, shaped by that function, defined by it. It's darker in some ways than the alien theory. It's about power and exploitation and the stories we tell to make sense of why some people rule and others serve, why some prosper and others suffer. But it feels more human to me, more honest about what these texts might actually preserve. There's a concept in Sumerian thought called me, usually translated as divine decree or cosmic principle. The me are like fundamental laws or powers that govern reality. Things like kingship, priesthood, truth, music, metalworking, writing. They're not just ideas. They're more like forces or tools or authorities that can be possessed, transferred, stolen. In one myth, Inanna, the goddess of love and war, gets Enki drunk and steals a bunch of me from him, bringing them from Eridu to her city Uruk. Enki tries to get them back but fails. The me Inanna took become Uruk's permanently, making the city great and powerful. Now what is that story actually about? Divine theft? Or is it mythologized memory of cultural diffusion, of how cities acquired technologies and practices and institutions from each other, sometimes through trade, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through clever acquisition? I lean toward the latter. The me seem to represent something real, the transferable elements of civilization, the knowledge and structures and authorities that can move from place to place, that aren't bound to specific people, but exist as preservable, teachable, inheritable things. And the Anunnaki, in many texts, are the ones who assign the me, who distribute cosmic functions and authorities. They decide which god gets which domain, which city gets which blessings, which humans get which responsibilities. They're the distributors of order, the assigners of place and function. That feels like a mythological way of talking about how social structures work, how roles get assigned and authority gets legitimized and hierarchy gets established. It's not describing literal divine beings making literal cosmic assignments. It's describing, preserving, thinking through how civilization organizes itself, where authority comes from, why things are structured the way they are. And woven through all of it is this awareness of limits, of boundaries, of consequences for transgression. The me have proper places, proper possessors. When they're stolen or misused, there are consequences. When humans claim me that aren't properly theirs, when they reach beyond their assigned function, things go wrong. Gilgamesh again. He's warned not to enter the cedar forest, not to kill Humbaba, the guardian placed there by the gods. The forest is sacred, protected, off limits. But Gilgamesh wants fame, glory, immortality through great deeds. He transgresses. He and Enkidu kill Humbaba, cut down the sacred cedars. And the consequence? Enkidu's death. It comes directly from that transgression. The text is clear about cause and effect. You violated a sacred boundary, someone must pay. It's not arbitrary divine anger. It's cosmic law, consequence built into the structure of reality according to Sumerian thought. And Gilgamesh, for all his power, can't escape it. His grief, his terror of death, his desperate quest for immortality, none of it changes the fundamental law. Humans die. That's our limit. That's the boundary we can't cross no matter how mighty we are, how beloved by gods, how great our deeds. Every attempt to transcend it fails. Gilgamesh finds the plant of immortality at the bottom of the sea and loses it to a serpent on the way home. He finds Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted eternal life, and learns that path is closed. That was a one-time exception never to be repeated. He returns to Uruk empty-handed, mortal, defeated by the one limit he can't overcome. But the text doesn't end in despair. It ends with Gilgamesh accepting his mortality and finding meaning within it. He returns to his city, walks its walls, takes pride in what he built, what will outlast him. The last lines of the epic describe the walls of Uruk, their strength and beauty, the work of Gilgamesh that remains after his death. It's a shift from trying to transcend human limits to accepting them and finding meaning within them, finding immortality not in living forever, but in creating something that endures, in building well, in serving your function properly. That feels like the real wisdom the text is trying to preserve. Not that humans are helpless victims of cruel gods, but that we have limits appropriate to our nature, and meaning comes from working well within those limits, rather than constantly transgressing them in search of what we're not meant to have. I think about this in relation to our current moment, our current civilization, though I'm cautious about making direct parallels. But we're in a phase of incredible human power, incredible reach and impact on the planet. We can split atoms, edit genes, redirect rivers, alter the climate itself. We're reaching toward capabilities that would have seemed divine to the Sumerians, to any ancient civilization. And we tell ourselves stories about this power, about transcending limits, about how technology will save us from death, from scarcity, from the constraints of physical reality. We're constantly pushing boundaries, transgressing limits that previous generations accepted as fixed. And I find myself wondering what the Sumerian scribes would make of it, what warnings they might press into clay for us if they could. Because their texts are so insistent about this theme, so consistent across different stories and different periods. There are limits. Transgressing them has consequences, noise and disruption that exceed what the system can absorb, trigger response, correction, reduction. Am I saying our civilization is about to flood? No, I don't think ancient text predicts specific modern events. That's not how any of this works. But I do think patterns recur, that human tendencies toward excess and boundary transgression are consistent across time, and that the warnings preserved in these ancient texts might be worth hearing even if the specific context has changed. We're very loud now. Our civilization, our industry, our consumption, our sheer numbers and impact. We're exceeding parameters, disrupting systems, triggering responses from the planet itself in the form of climate change, ecosystem collapse, resource depletion, and we keep telling ourselves we can engineer our way out, that there's no real limit to human ingenuity, that every boundary can be pushed or transcended. Maybe that's true. Maybe we really are different from every previous civilization that thought it had transcended limits only to discover them the hard way. But the Sumerian texts suggest caution, suggest humility, suggest paying attention to warning signs before the response becomes catastrophic. There's a prayer text, a lamentation really, from the city of after it was destroyed by invaders around 2000 BCE. The text describes the goddess of Ningal, trying to plead with the assembly of the Anunnaki to spare her city. She begs, she argues, she offers anything, but the decree has been passed. The Anunnaki have decided. Time is over. The city will be destroyed, its people scattered, its glory ended, and it happens exactly as decreed. The lamentation describes the destruction in heartbreaking detail, the sacred places burned, the people killed or enslaved, the goddess herself abandoning her temple because she can no longer bear to watch. It's one of the most emotionally devastating texts I've read from ancient Mesopotamia. But what strikes me is the inevitability of it. Once the Anunnaki decide, once the decree is passed in assembly, nothing can change it. No amount of pleading, no goddesses' tears, no human resistance. The cosmic law moves forward. Consequence follows transgression, or maybe just follows time, follows the natural cycles of rise and fall that seem to govern cities and civilizations. What was Ur's transgression? The text doesn't say clearly. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe it was just time, just the way things work. Cities rise, flourish, and fall. Civilizations have lifespans. Nothing lasts forever in the human realm. That's another limit, another boundary we can't cross. We can build magnificently, create wonders, preserve knowledge, but eventually the desert takes it back. The rivers shift, the invaders come, the people forget, and all that remains are fragments, broken tablets, ruins under sand, stories half-remembered and garbled in translation. Is that depressing? I don't think the Sumerians thought so. I think they accepted it as the nature of things, built and created and preserved anyway, did their work within time rather than pretending to transcend it. The scribal schools where young Sumerians learned to write, where these texts were copied and preserved, they had a particular ethos that comes through in some of the school texts we've found. The students were taught that they were part of a tradition, that they were receiving knowledge from the past and responsible for passing it to the future. They copied texts their teachers copied, who copied from their teachers, going back generations. Some tablets have colophons, notes at the end, listing the scribe's name and his teacher's name and sometimes his teacher's teacher. It's a chain of transmission, a recognition that knowledge persists not because it's written in stone, but because each generation chooses to preserve it, to value it, to pass it on. And that feels relevant to how we should approach these texts about the Anunnaki, about limits and warnings and cosmic law. We're not the first generation to receive them. Hundreds of generations of Mesopotamians preserved these stories, found them meaningful enough to copy and teach and remember. Then the tradition broke. The languages died. The cities were abandoned. The tablets were buried and forgotten for millennia. We found them again, dug them up, deciphered the languages, translated the texts, and now we have a choice about what to do with them, what they mean to us, whether they have anything to say to our moment. I think they do, but not as prophecy, not as hidden truth about aliens or conspiracy. I think they speak as preserved caution from people who built civilization in a harsh land and learned some hard lessons about sustainability, about limits, about what happens when you exceed the carrying capacity of your environment or the tolerance of your cosmic context, however you want to frame that. They learned to listen for warnings. They learned to build arcs when warned. They learned to accept limits instead of constantly transgressing them. They learned that noise and disruption have consequences, and they thought all of that was important enough to preserve in their most sacred texts, their founding myths, their wisdom literature. Part 3. There's another aspect of the Anunnaki tradition I want to explore, something about judgment and accountability. In several texts, the Anunnaki function as divine judges, particularly of the dead. In the Sumerian underworld called Kur, or sometimes Akala, the Anunnaki sit in judgment over souls. They determine fate, pronounce verdicts, assign places in the afterlife hierarchy. The underworld itself is described as a dark, quiet place, a land of no return where everyone goes regardless of how they lived. It's not quite the later idea of hell, not really punishment in the Christian sense, but there are gradations, differences in how the dead are treated based on how they lived and died and how properly they were buried. The Anunnaki in the underworld aren't cruel exactly, but they're implacable, unmoved by pleading or regret. They judge according to law, according to what was done, what oaths were kept or broken, what responsibilities were fulfilled or abandoned. There's a text describing Inanna's descent to the underworld where she has to pass through 7 gates, removing one divine garment or power at each gate until she stands naked and powerless before Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, and the Anunnaki judges. They pass judgment on her. She's killed, hung on a hook, turned to rotting meat. Only clever intervention by Enki saves her, and even then she can't leave without providing a substitute. Her husband Dumuzi ends up taking her place for half the year, establishing the cycle of seasons. The story is usually read as vegetation myth, explaining why things die in summer and return in spring. But what stays with me is the absolute authority of the underworld Anunnaki, the impossibility of escaping their judgment once you're in their realm. Even a great goddess, even Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, has no power there. She's subject to the same law, the same judgment, the same consequence as anyone else. That's interesting to me because it suggests accountability extends even to the powerful, even to the divine. There's a cosmic law that operates above individual will, above personal power, above hierarchy. You can be mighty in the upper world, but in the underworld, in the place of judgment and consequence, none of that matters. What matters is what you did, what laws you honoured or violated, what your true nature was beneath the garments of power and status. It's a levelling, a reminder that no one is exempt, no one stands outside the system of accountability. I wonder if that provided comfort to the powerless in Sumerian society, the enslaved and the poor and the conquered. In this life you might suffer under kings and priests and landlords, but in death everyone faces the same judges, everyone is stripped of pretense and power, everyone receives what they're due according to cosmic law rather than human hierarchy. Maybe that's wishful thinking, ideology serving the powerful by promising eventual justice so the oppressed don't rebel in the present. But maybe it's also genuine attempt to articulate a moral order, sense that despite appearances, despite the injustice of lived experience, there's a deeper structure of consequence and accountability that no one escapes. The idea of the Anunnaki as witnesses and judges shows up in oath formulas too. When Mesopotamians swore oaths, particularly important ones like treaties between kings or marriage contracts or business agreements, they often invoked the Anunnaki as witnesses. The oath would say something like, "By the great Anunnaki, by the 7 gods who judge," and then spell out the terms and the curse that would follow if the oath was broken. The assumption being that the Anunnaki see, remember, and enforce. You can't hide from them. You can't lie to them. They know what was promised and they'll ensure consequence follows if you break faith. This isn't unique to Mesopotamia. Lots of cultures invoke divine witnesses for oaths. But the specific framing of the Anunnaki as assembly, as collective, as judges rather than individual personality gods, that's distinctive. It suggests law rather than relationship, principle rather than favour, impersonal consequence rather than personal anger. In our modern context, we've mostly lost the sense of cosmic accountability. We have human laws, human courts, human enforcement, but they're understood as human constructs, things we made and can change, and that apply inconsistently based on power and wealth and status. There's no deeper law we imagine ourselves subject to, no cosmic witnesses ensuring consequence follows transgression. We can break faith, violate agreements, harm each other, and if we're powerful or clever enough, we face no consequence at all. We might feel guilt, social disapproval, internal conflict, but there's no Anunnaki assembly waiting to judge us, no cosmic law we can't escape. Is that liberation, or is it something else? I'm not sure. On one hand, yes, we're free from superstition, from imaginary enforcement of arbitrary rules. We make our own meaning, our own ethics, our own accountability structures. But on the other hand, without some sense of cosmic consequence, without believing we're accountable to something beyond human power, maybe we're more likely to transgress, to abuse power, to break faith when it's convenient. Maybe the Sumerian who swore by the Anunnaki and truly believed they watched and would judge, maybe that person was more reliable, more trustworthy, than someone who knows accountability depends entirely on getting caught by human authorities. I'm not arguing for return to ancient superstition. I don't think the Anunnaki are literally watching and judging. But I do think there's something lost when we abandon the framework entirely, when we reduce everything to human construct and individual choice and situational ethics. The Sumerian framework, for all its strangeness to us, provided a sense of structure, of limits, of accountability that operated regardless of human awareness or enforcement. And maybe we need some version of that, updated for our understanding, compatible with science and reason, but providing the same function of reminding us we're not the ultimate arbiters, we're not exempt, we're not free to do whatever we can get away with without consequence. The consequences might not come from literal divine judges, but they come. Ecological consequence, social consequence, psychological consequence. We can ignore or deny them, but they operate regardless, like cosmic law, like the Anunnaki assembly passing judgment whether we acknowledge their authority or not. There's a tension in the Sumerian material between fate and choice, between what's decreed and what humans can influence. Some texts suggest everything is predetermined, decided in the assembly of the Anunnaki, written on the tablets of destiny, inevitable. Other texts suggest humans have agency, can change outcomes through wisdom or action or divine favor, can learn and adapt and avoid catastrophe. The flood narratives show both. The flood is decreed, inevitable, passed by the assembly and set in motion. But Atrahasis or Ziusudra, the human hero, he hears warning, acts on it, survives. So is the flood fate or is survival choice? I think the Sumerian answer, if there is one, is both somehow. The large patterns, the cosmic cycles, the rise and fall of civilizations, those are decreed, built into the structure of how things work. But within those patterns, individual humans and cities have agency, can make choices that affect outcomes within limits. You can't prevent the flood, but you can build an ark. You can't escape mortality, but you can live well, build well, create something that endures. You can't transcend cosmic law, but you can align with it, work within it, honor it instead of transgressing it. That feels like useful framework, actually, more useful than either pure determinism or pure free will. We're not helpless victims of fate, but we're also not unlimited creators of reality through will and intention. We're somewhere in between, operating within systems and cycles and laws we didn't create and can't change, but having meaningful choice about how we respond, how we align or transgress, how we build and preserve and pass on. The Sumerians, at least in some of their texts, seem to have understood this balance. They didn't waste energy raging against mortality or entropy or the fall of cities. They accepted those as cosmic law, as the nature of things in the human realm. But within that acceptance they built magnificently. They created art and literature and law codes and architectural wonders. They preserved knowledge across generations. They established traditions that in some form survived thousands of years. That's agency, meaningful human action, even within the context of inevitable decline and death and forgetting. I think about the scribes again, the ones who copied these texts about the Anunnaki, about limits and warnings and cosmic law. They knew, they must have known that their cities wouldn't last forever, that languages change and civilizations fall and eventually everything is sand and silence. But they copied anyway. They taught students anyway. They pressed their reeds into wet clay, making marks that would harden, that would preserve, that would outlast them by millennia. That's not denial of mortality or entropy. That's working within it, accepting it, and doing the work anyway because the work itself has meaning, because preserving and passing on is what humans do. It's our function, maybe, our way of participating in cosmic order even as we're subject to cosmic law. We can't transcend death, but we can transcend forgetting if we work at it, if we value preservation, if each generation accepts responsibility for receiving and passing on what matters. What matters about the Anunnaki tradition, in my view, isn't whether they were literal beings or metaphors or misremembered history or mythologized social structure. What matters is what the tradition preserves, what it's trying to pass on across generations. And what I hear in these texts, again and again in different forms, is warning about excess, about transgression, about noise and disruption, and exceeding sustainable limits. I hear recognition that creation requires maintenance, that order requires constant work, that civilization is precarious and can fail catastrophically if we ignore warning signs. I hear acknowledgement that we're part of larger systems, cosmic or ecological or social, and that those systems have carrying capacities, thresholds, boundaries we transgress at our peril. I hear the importance of listening, of paying attention to warning, of building arcs when warned even if the warning sounds crazy, even if you can't see the flood yet. And I hear something else, something quieter. I hear acceptance of limits as not just constraint but as defining structure, as the thing that makes meaning possible. If we were unlimited, if we could do anything, be anything, transcend any boundary, what would give our choices weight, our actions meaning? It's the limits, the mortality, the bounded nature of human existence that makes what we do matter. Gilgamesh's acceptance of mortality at the end of his epic, his return to Uruk, and his pride in the walls that will outlast him, that's not defeat. That's finding meaning within limits, finding immortality of a sort through building well, through leaving something of value, through accepting his function and doing it properly. The Anunnaki tradition, in some of its expressions, seems to be teaching that. Not that limits are arbitrary divine cruelty, but that they're necessary structure, defining boundary, the thing that makes existence in time meaningful rather than arbitrary. Part 4, I want to address something directly, something I've been dancing around. There's a strong current in modern Anunnaki interpretation that reads these texts as describing genetic manipulation, as ancient astronauts, creating or modifying humans for slave labour. The blood of Wiela mixed with clay to create humans, that gets read as genetic engineering, as splicing alien and terrestrial DNA. The Anunnaki descending from heaven that become spaceships. Their long reigns before the flood, those become actual lifespans of beings with advanced technology or different biology. And look, I understand why that reading emerged, why it appeals to people. It makes the ancient texts relevant to modern categories, to science fiction and technology and conspiracy. It gives the texts weight in a secular age that doesn't value mythology for its own sake. But I think it does violence to what the texts actually are, what they're actually doing. When the Atrahasis epic says humans were made from clay and divine blood, I don't think it's describing a literal biological process. I think it's doing what creation myths do, explaining human nature symbolically, theologically. The clay is our earthly, mortal, material nature. We're from the ground, we return to the ground, we're shaped and temporary like clay vessels. The divine blood is whatever makes us more than just clay, whatever gives us consciousness, agency, the capacity to learn and create and preserve. Maybe that's literally divine spark if you believe in such things. Maybe it's emergent complexity, the strange loop of self-awareness arising from matter. But either way, the text is making a claim about human nature being dual, caught between earth and heaven, matter and spirit, mortality and something else. Reading it as ancient genetics misses that completely, flattens the symbolism into crude literalism. And the problem with the ancient astronaut reading, beyond just missing the symbolism, is that it projects our categories backward onto a people who thought completely differently. The Sumerians didn't have our concept of aliens, of interplanetary travel, of genetic engineering. Those are 20th century ideas, science fiction, concepts. When they said beings came from heaven, they meant heaven in their cosmology, the realm of sky and stars and divine presence, not outer space in our sense. When they described long reigns, they were using a different numerical system, a different relationship to time and history, possibly sacred numbers with symbolic meaning rather than literal chronology. When they talked about creation and divine essence, they were operating in mythic and theological categories that aren't reducible to biology and technology. Imposing our framework on their texts is a kind of colonialism, actually, a refusal to let them be what they are. It says their actual worldview doesn't matter, isn't valid, needs to be translated into our terms to have meaning. And in the process, we lose what they were actually trying to preserve. We lose the theological depth, the moral complexity, the social commentary, the preserved caution about limits and consequences. We turn it into a simple story about aliens making slaves, which says something about our anxieties, our sense of being controlled and manipulated by hidden forces, but says nothing about what the Sumerians actually thought, or experienced, or were trying to pass on. I find that frustrating because the actual texts, approached on their own terms, are so much richer and stranger and more relevant than the simplified alien version. The Sumerian worldview, as far as we can reconstruct it from texts and material culture, understood the universe as alive, as conscious, as structured by will and purpose at every level. The gods weren't separate from nature, they were nature personified, nature understood as having agency and intention. The sky god An was literally the sky, but the sky was conscious, had will, made decisions. The earth goddess Kai was the earth, but alive, responsive, capable of withholding or granting fertility. Water, grain, metalworking, writing. These weren't just things, they were me. Divine decrees or cosmic, principles with their own nature and power. Everything was ensouled, everything participated in cosmic order or chaos. Humans weren't separate observers of dead matter. We were part of the living whole, subject to the same cosmic laws as everything else, capable of aligning with order or contributing to chaos. That's so different from our mechanistic, secular worldview that it's hard to even grasp fully. We see the universe as mostly dead, governed by impersonal physical laws, with consciousness and anomaly confined to biological brains. We're observers, separate from what we observe, capable of manipulating matter without consequence because matter doesn't care, isn't conscious, doesn't respond except mechanically. The Sumerian universe was the opposite. Everything was conscious, everything responded, Everything was embedded in webs of relationship and obligation and consequence. You couldn't just do things without cosmic ramifications. Your actions affected the cosmic order, pleased or displeased divine forces, aligned or misaligned with the structure of reality. And that meant you had to pay attention, had to listen for warnings, had to maintain right relationship with the various powers and principles governing your life. Is that literally true? I don't think we can answer that in the way the question implies. The universe the Sumerians described doesn't map onto the universe science describes. They're different categories, different ways of organizing experience and meaning. Science tells us about physical processes, about mechanism and causation in the material realm. Mythology tells us about meaning, purpose, value, relationship. They're not competing explanations for the same thing. They're different kinds of explanation for different kinds of questions. The Sumerian texts aren't trying to explain how matter behaves. They're trying to explain why things happen the way they do, what we owe to various powers, how to live well within cosmic structure. And from that perspective, the alien theory is not only wrong but incoherent. It tries to take mythological and theological claims and read them as bad science, as primitive attempts to describe technology they didn't understand. But that's not what mythology is. That's not what it does. Let me try this differently. Imagine you're a Sumerian farmer, living 4,000 years ago in a mud brick house near Uruk. Your life depends on the irrigation canals that bring water from the river to your fields. Those canals were dug by your grandfather and his grandfather, maintained by communal labor organized by the temple, part of a vast system that makes life possible in a region that otherwise wouldn't support large populations. When you think about those canals, you don't think impressive engineering project using principles of hydrology and manual labor. You think gift of Enki, god of sweet waters, who taught humans to manage water, who provides abundance through the canals if we maintain them properly and honor him with sacrifices. Both perspectives are in some sense true. The canals do work through physical principles, but they also represent knowledge passed down, social organization, divine gift, in the sense that life and abundance flow through them. The Sumerian framework captures the meaning, the significance, the gratitude and obligation you feel, in a way the mechanical description doesn't. When you hear stories about the Anunnaki, about how they organized the world and established cities and created humans to maintain cosmic order, you're not thinking aliens with technology. You're thinking about your actual life, your actual role in the social and cosmic order. You labor in the fields, you maintain the canals, you provide grain that feeds the temple staff who perform the rituals that keep the gods pleased and the cosmos functioning. You're part of that system. The myths explain why, explain what happens if the system breaks down, explain your responsibility and your place. They're not history in our sense, not science, but they're not just made-up stories either. They're the meaningful framework that makes your life make sense, that connects your daily labor to cosmic purpose, that gives you dignity and significance despite being small and mortal and subject to forces you can't control. And the warnings in those myths, about noise and excess and transgression, those aren't about literal divine anger. They're about what happens when the system gets out of balance, when population exceeds carrying capacity, when demand outstrips resources, when social order breaks down. The Sumerians lived that multiple times. Cities fell, dynasties ended, invasions came, droughts killed thousands. They knew precariousness, knew that abundance and order could vanish suddenly, knew that warning signs preceded catastrophe. The myths preserve that knowledge in mythic language because that's the language they had, that's how they thought. And the knowledge is still valid even if the framework is foreign to us. Population does have limits. Systems do have carrying capacity. Transgression does have consequences. Ignoring warnings does lead to catastrophe. We just describe it in different terms now, ecological and economic and social rather than divine and cosmic. But the pattern is the same. So when I read the Anunnaki texts, I'm not looking for hidden truth about ancient aliens. I'm looking for preserved wisdom about limits, about systems, about consequences, about how to live within structure rather than constantly transgressing it. And I find that wisdom there, consistently, across multiple texts from multiple periods. It's not always pleasant wisdom. It acknowledges hierarchy, accepts suffering, sometimes seems to justify oppression by attributing it to divine decree. I'm not claiming the Sumerians had perfect ethics, or that we should adopt their worldview wholesale, but within their framework, within their experience of building and Maintaining civilization in a harsh environment, they learned things worth preserving about sustainability, about limits, about the dangers of excess. And they preserved those learnings in the most durable form they had, pressed into clay, copied by generations of scribes, passed down as sacred tradition. The fact that we found these tablets, deciphered them, can read them now 4,000 years later, that's remarkable. Most of what the Sumerians created is gone. The cities are ruins, the language is dead, the people are dust. But the words remain, the warnings remain, the wisdom remains if we're willing to hear it on its own terms, rather than translating it into alien conspiracy or dismissing it as primitive superstition. The Anunnaki tradition is neither of those things. It's complex mythology, theological reflection, social commentary, and preserved caution all wrapped together in symbolic narrative. It rewards slow reading, careful attention, willingness to sit with ambiguity, and multiple meanings. It resists simple interpretation, resists being reduced to one clear message or claim. And that's appropriate, I think, for knowledge meant to guide across changing contexts, meant to be reinterpreted by each generation while maintaining core truths. What are those core truths as I understand them from these texts? First, that we're part of larger systems we didn't create and can't control, cosmic or ecological or social, and we need to respect the limits and requirements of those systems. Second, that creation requires maintenance, that order requires constant work, that civilization is achievement not default and can be lost. Third, that excess has consequences, that transgressing limits triggers response, that noise and disruption that exceed carrying capacity provoke correction. Fourth, that warnings are given before catastrophe, that we can hear them and respond if we're paying attention, if we're humble enough to listen. Fifth, that our role is stewardship, within limits, not unlimited dominion, not transcendence of boundaries. And sixth, that meaning comes from accepting limits and working well within them, rather than constantly reaching for what we're not meant to have. None of those are uniquely Sumerian insights. You can find them in other wisdom traditions, in ecological science, in lived experience if you pay attention. But the Sumerian articulation has particular power because it's so old, because it comes from people building civilization for the first time at that scale, learning these lessons as they went, preserving them for whoever came after. We came after. We found their words. We have the choice now of hearing the warnings or ignoring them, of accepting limits or transgressing them, of maintaining what we've built or letting it collapse through noise and excess and arrogance. The Anunnaki texts don't tell us what to do specifically. They can't. Context has changed too much, but they can remind us of patterns, consequences, the importance of listening and limits and stewardship. Part 5. There's one more dimension I want to explore before we wind down. Something about memory and forgetting, about what gets preserved and what gets lost and why it matters. The Sumerian tradition didn't preserve everything equally. What survives is what scribes chose to copy, what temples chose to keep, what got valued enough to reproduce generation after generation. Most daily life, most ordinary experience, most of what most people thought and felt and did, that's gone completely. We have receipts and contracts, bureaucratic records, some letters, but the vast majority of human experience in ancient Sumer is irrecoverable. What we have is the curated tradition, the texts deemed important enough to preserve. Religious texts, royal inscriptions, wisdom literature, epics, hymns. The Anunnaki material is in that preserved category, which tells us something. This wasn't marginal belief, forgotten folklore. This was central. Tradition, important enough to copy, to teach, to maintain, across centuries of cultural change. Why? What made these particular stories, these particular warnings, worth preserving? I think it's because they addressed permanent questions, enduring tensions. How do we understand power and hierarchy? Where does authority come from and what makes it legitimate? What's our relationship to forces beyond our control? How do we live with mortality, with the knowledge that we and our cities and our civilizations won't last? What are our responsibilities to future generations? What happens when we transgress limits? These aren't questions that get answered once and settled. Every generation has to grapple with them, has to find their own understanding while drawing on inherited wisdom. The Anunnaki texts provided framework for that grappling, symbolic language for thinking through those questions in ways that worked for Sumerian culture. When the tradition broke, When Sumerian culture collapsed and the language died and the texts were buried, those questions didn't go away. Later Mesopotamian cultures, the Akkadians and Babylonians and Assyrians, they inherited the Anunnaki tradition, translated it, adapted it to their own contexts. The basic framework persisted even as details changed. The assembly of gods, the cosmic law, the warnings about transgression, the flood narrative, all of that survived in modified form. It spread beyond Mesopotamia too, influenced neighbouring cultures, eventually fed into biblical tradition, where we see echoes in Genesis, in the flood story, in the Tower of Babel, in scattered references to divine assemblies and sons of God. The specific name Anunnaki mostly disappeared from later tradition, but the ideas persisted, transformed, reinterpreted, woven into new frameworks. And then even that broke down. The cuneiform traditions ended, the tablets were forgotten, the languages became unreadable. For over 2,000 years, the Anunnaki existed only as fragments in derivative texts, biblical references that nobody understood the background of, scattered mentions in Greek and Roman writers who got their information second-hand and garbled. The original tradition was lost, completely inaccessible. Until we found the tablets again in the 19th century, until scholars painstakingly deciphered the scripts and languages, until we could read Sumerian again and recover the tradition from its own sources. That's an astonishing recovery, an act of collective scholarship spanning more than a century now. Thousands of researchers piecing together fragments, reconstructing grammar, debating meanings, slowly making accessible what was lost. But here's the thing. We recovered the words but not the worldview. We can read what the tablets say, but we can't think like Sumerians, can't feel what they felt, can't understand exactly what these texts meant to them in their context. We're always translating, always interpreting, always bringing our own assumptions and categories. The texts themselves are fixed, are what they are, preserved in clay. But their meaning is fluid, changes with each generation of readers, each new context of interpretation. The Sumerians who first pressed these stories into clay would not recognize most modern readings of them. The alien theories would be incomprehensible to them. Even academic scholarship, dry philological analysis of grammar and historical context, that's not how they engaged with these texts. These were living traditions, sacred stories, performed in ritual, taught in schools, referenced in daily life. They were part of the breathing culture, not museum artifacts. Can we recover that living quality? Can these texts mean something to us the way they meant something to their original audience? I think yes and no. We can't recreate Sumerian consciousness, can't believe what they believed the way they believed it, but we can engage with the questions the texts address, the patterns they preserve, the warnings they encode. We can let them challenge our assumptions, expand our categories, remind us of different ways of understanding relationship between human and cosmos. We can hear the caution about limits and excess and consequences, translate that into our own context, apply it to our own situation. That's not the same as what the Sumerian farmer experienced hearing these stories, but it's not unrelated either. It's keeping the tradition alive in new form, finding new meaning while honouring old wisdom. The question of memory and preservation feels urgent to me in ways it probably didn't to the Sumerians. They assumed continuity, assumed their civilization would persist, that scribes would keep copying, that temples would keep teaching. They were wrong, obviously. Their civilization ended, their language died, their tradition broke. But they couldn't have known that. We, on the other hand, we live with constant awareness of fragility, of how quickly things can be lost. We've seen languages die, cultures disappear, traditions end. We know that what seems permanent can vanish in a generation. Digital preservation adds new anxieties. Tablets last 4,000 years. Will digital files last 40? We're creating more information than any previous civilization, preserving it in more formats, but formats that might be unreadable in decades, dependent on technologies that might not exist in a century. The Sumerian scribe pressing reed into clay had no idea his work would last millennia, but it did because clay is durable and the script is recoverable if you find enough examples. Our digital age might preserve everything or nothing depending on whether future generations can read our formats, access our servers, care enough to maintain continuity. So there's irony in recovering the Anunnaki tradition. We found what the Sumerians preserved, made it accessible again after millennia of loss. But are we preserving it now? Are we passing it on in forms that will last, that will be accessible, that will mean something to future generations? The academic work is preserved in libraries, in journals, in university archives. But how many people read academic journals on Sumerian mythology? The popular interpretations reach more people, but distort the tradition, turn it into something it's not. Videos like this one, if anyone's still listening this deep into the night, they reach some audience, they try to present the material thoughtfully. But will they last? Will anyone care in 10 years, 50 years, 100? I don't know. I hope so. I think the warnings and wisdom in these texts are relevant regardless of when you encounter them. But preservation requires each generation to value what came before, to take responsibility for passing it on, to do the work of maintaining continuity. The Sumerians understood this, I think, understood that they were links in a chain, receiving from the past and responsible for the future. The scribal colophons that list teachers going back generations, that's acknowledgement of chain, of tradition, of debt to the past and obligation to the future. When that chain breaks, when a generation decides the old wisdom isn't worth preserving, when new concerns crowd out ancient caution, the tradition dies, and then later generations have to rediscover it the hard way, through catastrophe, through exceeding limits and facing consequences, and learning again what was already known and forgotten. That seems wasteful to me, tragic. Not inevitable, but requiring active choice to prevent. We have to choose to value old wisdom, to preserve it, to engage with it seriously, to pass it on. That's work, requires effort and resources and time, but the alternative is having to relearn everything through suffering, which is how humanity has mostly operated, each civilization rising and falling, and the next one starting fresh with no memory of what came before. The Anunnaki texts suggest the gods, or cosmic law, or however we want to frame it, they remember. They preserve knowledge of what happened before, what consequences followed, what actions, what warnings were given and ignored. The assembly of the Anunnaki has access to the tablets of destiny, knows what's decreed, what patterns operate, what limits exist. Humans forget, but the cosmic order doesn't. That's theology, not something I can verify or refute. But as metaphor, as symbolic claim, it's interesting. It says that consequences operate whether we remember previous examples or not, that patterns recur whether we're aware of them or not, that cosmic law continues regardless of human memory or attention. We can choose to learn from preserved wisdom, or we can ignore it and learn from direct experience. Either way we learn. But one path involves a lot more suffering. I think that's part of what the flood narratives preserve, not just that floods happen, not just that civilizations can be destroyed, but that warning is given, that knowledge of patterns exists, that we can prepare if we listen. Atrahasis hears the warning through the reed wall and builds an ark. He survives. His neighbours, presumably, didn't hear or didn't listen or didn't believe. They died. The difference isn't that Atrahasis was special in some inherent way. The difference is that he paid attention, he listened, he took the warning seriously. He did the work of preparation even when it must have seemed crazy, building a huge boat in the desert because a voice through a wall said flood was coming. That's faith maybe, or wisdom, or just the humility to accept that you might not know everything, that force is greater than you might understand patterns you don't see. That caution is better than arrogance. Our civilization doesn't listen well to warnings. We're very good at rationalization, at finding reasons why this time is different, why old patterns don't apply, why limits that constrained previous generations don't constrain us. We're louder than any previous civilization, more disruptive, more confident in our ability to engineer solutions to any problem. And maybe we're right. Maybe we really have transcended old limits through technology and knowledge and organization. But the Sumerian texts suggest caution about that confidence. They suggest that every civilization thinks it's special, thinks it's different, thinks it's figured out how to transcend the old patterns. And then the patterns reassert themselves, the limits prove real, the consequences arrive. I'm not predicting specific catastrophe. I don't think the Anunnaki are going to send a flood or plague. But I do think we're testing limits, ecological and social and maybe cosmic in ways we don't fully understand. And the warnings are there if we choose to listen. Climate change is warning. Ecosystem collapse is warning. Resource depletion is warning. Social breakdown is warning. These aren't divine messages, they're systemic feedback, the consequences of exceeding carrying capacity, of disrupting fundamental balances, of transgressing limits built into the structure of planetary reality. We can hear those warnings and adjust, build our arcs, change course, accept constraints. Or we can rationalize and deny and continue until the response becomes catastrophic and undeniable. The Sumerian texts don't tell us which we'll choose, they just preserve the pattern, the knowledge that this choice point arrives, that warnings precede catastrophe, that preparation is possible for those who listen. What we do with that knowledge is on us, is our responsibility as the current generation holding the chain of tradition. Part 6. I'm aware we're deep into the night now, deep into this exploration, and I want to start moving towards something like closure though. These topics never really close, they just pause, wait for the next person to pick them up and turn them over and see what new light reveals, what stays with me, what I keep coming back to. After all this thinking about the Anunnaki, all this reading of ancient texts and modern interpretations and scholarly debates, is a sense of continuity and rupture both at once. Continuity in that the questions are still the questions, the patterns still the patterns, the human situation fundamentally similar across 4,000 years. We're still building civilizations in precarious balance. We're still subject to limits we don't fully understand. We're still capable of excess, of transgression, of noise that disrupts cosmic or ecological order. We're still mortal, still small, still dependent on systems we didn't create. And we're still responsible for preservation, for maintenance, for passing on what matters to whoever comes after. But rupture too, profound rupture in worldview, in how we understand ourselves and cosmos and meaning. The Sumerians lived in an unsouled universe, responsive and conscious and structured by divine will. We live in a mechanistic universe, mostly dead, governed by impersonal law, with consciousness a strange exception. The Sumerians understood themselves as serving divine purpose, maintaining cosmic order through labor and ritual. We understand ourselves as autonomous individuals, creating our own meaning, subject only to physical law and human agreement. The Sumerians accepted hierarchy as cosmic structure, divinely ordained, permanent. We challenge hierarchy, value equality, see social structures as human constructs open to change. These aren't minor differences, they're fundamental ruptures in how reality is understood and experienced. Can we bridge that rupture? Can Sumerian wisdom speak across that gap, or are we too different, too separated by worldview and context for meaningful transmission? I think we can bridge it, but not by pretending the differences don't exist, not by flattening their worldview into ours, or romanticizing theirs as superior. We bridge it by recognizing what's being pointed to beneath the specific cultural expression, by translating not words but patterns, not theology but wisdom about patterns. When the Anunnaki texts warn about noise and excess, we don't need to believe in literal divine assembly to hear the warning about carrying capacity and systemic disruption. When they describe consequences for transgressing cosmic boundaries, we don't need theology of divine judgment to recognize that systems have limits, and violating them produces response. When they preserve flood narratives, we don't need to believe in angry gods to value the knowledge that catastrophe happens, that warning precedes it, that preparation is possible. The symbolic language, the mythic framework that's culturally specific doesn't translate directly, but the patterns underneath, those are real, those persist, those operate whether we use religious language or scientific language or no language at all. Ecological systems have carrying capacity regardless of whether you understand that as cosmic law or evolutionary biology. Social systems have thresholds beyond which they break down regardless of whether you attribute that to divine decree or sociological analysis. Transgression has consequences, excess provokes response, limits exist. These are facts about how reality works at certain scales, and the Sumerians knew them, preserved them, tried to pass them on. We can receive that wisdom without adopting their entire worldview, without believing in their gods, without accepting their social hierarchies. We just need humility enough to recognize that ancient people weren't stupid, that they learned real things about sustainability and limits and consequences through hard experience, and that those learnings might be relevant to us even if the packaging is foreign. Part of what makes the Anunnaki tradition valuable now, I think, is precisely that it's not our tradition, not shaped by our assumptions and biases. It comes from outside our cultural stream, offers a different perspective, challenges our default ways of thinking. We're so embedded in narratives of progress, of transcendence, of unlimited human potential, of technology solving every problem. The Sumerian texts offer a different narrative, one focused on limits, on maintenance rather than transcendence, on cyclical pattern rather than linear progress, on consequences and accountability rather than unlimited freedom. That's uncomfortable. It challenges deep assumptions about human nature and possibility and destiny. But discomfort can be valuable, can be exactly what we need when our comfortable narratives are leading us toward catastrophe. I don't want to idealize the Sumerians or suggest we should return to their worldview. They had brutal aspects, accepted slavery and warfare and oppression as natural. Their preserved texts come mostly from elite perspective, temple and palace, not from the laborers and enslaved who did most of the actual work. Their warnings about noise and excess, those might have served the powerful, justifying control over the masses, explaining suffering as cosmic necessity rather than political choice. I'm aware of that, aware that ancient wisdom is never pure, never separable from the power structures that preserved it. But that doesn't mean there's nothing of value there, nothing worth recovering and engaging with critically. It means we have to be careful, have to distinguish what's genuinely wise from what's ideology, what serves sustainability from what serves hierarchy. The warnings about limits, about consequences, about the precariousness of civilization, those feel genuinely wise to me, feel like preserved knowledge from people who experienced collapse, who knew how quickly abundance can turn to famine, order to chaos, life to death. The warnings about noise specifically, about human disruption exceeding some threshold, those feel relevant to our moment in ways that make me uncomfortable. We are very loud. Our civilization, our technology, our sheer numbers and impact. We're disrupting systems at every scale, local to global, ecosystems to climate to perhaps something deeper we don't even have language for. And we keep telling ourselves it's fine, we'll adapt, we'll engineer solutions, there's no real limit to human ingenuity. The Sumerian texts whisper, that's what everyone thinks until the flood comes. That's what every civilization believes until consequence arrives. You're not special, you're not exempt. Patterns recur, limits are real. Is that true? I don't know with certainty. Maybe we are different. Maybe this time really is different. Maybe we really have transcended the old limits. But betting everything on that assumption, ignoring all warning signs, dismissing ancient caution as primitive superstition, that seems unwise. The humble approach, the cautious approach, is to assume limits are real until proven otherwise, to prepare for consequences, to listen for warnings, to build whatever arcs we might need while hoping we never need them. That's the atrosis model. He didn't know for certain the flood would come. He trusted the warning, did the work, prepared, and when the flood came, he survived. That's not faith in the sense of believing without evidence. That's practical wisdom, risk management, taking warnings seriously even when you can't verify them, acting on incomplete information because the cost of being wrong is catastrophic. What would our arcs look like? What preparation does our moment require? I don't have complete answers. I think it involves accepting limits, reducing our noise and impact, learning to maintain rather than constantly expand, valuing sustainability over growth, building resilience rather than assuming stability. I think it involves preserving knowledge in durable forms, maintaining chains of transmission, taking responsibility for passing on what matters. I think it involves listening to warnings, to ecological feedback, to social breakdown, to whatever signals suggest we're approaching thresholds. I think it involves humility about our knowledge and capabilities, recognition that we might not understand all the systems we're affecting, caution about confident assertions that everything will be fine. These are general principles, not specific prescriptions. How they apply depends on context, on who you are, what resources you have, what role you occupy. But the general direction seems clear from the Sumerian texts. Less arrogance, more humility, less noise, more listening, less transgression, more respect for limits, less assumption of unlimited possibility, more acceptance of bounded reality. And underlying all of it, this recognition that we're part of something larger, something that existed before us and will exist after us, something we didn't create and can't control but can align with or work against. The Sumerians called that the cosmic order, the divine structure, maintained by the Anunnaki assembly. We might call it the ecosystem, the biosphere, the physical laws governing planetary systems. Different language, different framework, but pointing at the same basic reality. We're embedded in systems with their own nature and requirements, and our flourishing depends on working with those systems rather than against them. That's not mysticism, that's ecology. But the Sumerians understood it in their own terms 4,000 years before ecology existed as a science, understood it well enough to preserve warnings about it in their most sacred texts. So in the end, what is the Anunnaki tradition? Is it history, mythology, theology, preserved wisdom, cultural artifact, warning system? Yes, all of those, none purely, all simultaneously in ways that resist simple categorization. It's what it is, pressed into clay by people who valued it enough to preserve it, recovered by scholars who valued it enough to decipher it, available now to anyone who values it enough to engage with it carefully and thoughtfully. What we do with it, what meaning we find in it, what warnings we hear or ignore, that's on us. The texts themselves are fixed, are complete in their fragmentary way. But their meaning continues to unfold, continues to be discovered, continues to speak to new contexts and new questions. I find myself grateful for the recovery of these texts, grateful to the scribes who copied them, grateful to the scholars who deciphered them, grateful for the possibility of engaging with voices from 4,000 years ago addressing questions that haven't gone away. There's something profound about that continuity, that connection, across such vast time. It reminds me that we're part of a chain, a tradition, a conversation that extends far beyond our individual lives and immediate context. We receive from the past, we contribute what we can in the present, we pass on to the future. That's our function maybe, our role in the cosmic order if there is one. Not to transcend time, but to work well within it, to be good links in the chain, to maintain what's worth maintaining and pass it on intact. The night is deep now, the questions remain, as they always do. The Anunnaki texts don't provide final answers, don't close the questions, don't release us from responsibility for thinking and choosing and acting. They witness, they warn, they preserve patterns for those willing to engage them. What we do with that is ours to decide. The assembly, if it exists, watches and remembers and judges. Or doesn't, if it doesn't. Either way, consequences follow choices, patterns recur, limits assert themselves. We can learn from preserved wisdom or from direct experience. We can listen for warnings or wait for catastrophe. We can build our arcs or trust that somehow everything will work out. These are choices every generation makes, choices that determine what survives and what's lost, what continues and what ends. I hope we choose wisely. I hope we listen. I hope we remember that we're not the first to face these questions, not the first to test limits, not the first to receive warnings. And I hope that when our time comes to be the ancestors, to be the voices preserved or forgotten by whoever comes after, I hope what we pass on is worth receiving, worth preserving, worth engaging with. That's the standard the Sumerian scribes set. 4,000 years later, we're still reading their words, still thinking about their warnings, still learning from their wisdom. That's successful transmission. That's meaningful preservation. That's the chain continuing despite rupture and loss, and the forgetting of entire civilizations. Can we do the same? Can what we create, what we preserve, what we pass on, can that last 4,000 years? Can it speak to people in contexts we can't imagine, address questions we can't foresee, provide wisdom that remains relevant despite radical changes in worldview and technology and social organization? I don't know, but I think trying is part of responsibility, part of what it means to be human, to be conscious in time, to be links in a chain that extends beyond our comprehension in both directions. The Sumerians tried. They pressed their warnings and wisdom and questions into wet clay. The clay hardened. The words remained. And here we are, deep into a quiet night thousands of years later, still listening, still thinking, still trying to understand what they thought important enough to preserve. That feels like enough. Not answers, but connection. Not certainty, but engagement. Not revelation, but continuing conversation across the vast distance of time and death and forgetting. The Anunnaki tradition lives in that conversation, in our willingness to receive it and think about it and pass it on in whatever form works for our time. What comes next is open, uncertain, dependent on choices we haven't made yet. The texts witness. The patterns persist. The warnings echo. And somewhere in the dark, quiet as embers fading, the ancient voices wait for whoever's ready to listen.